Welcome back to On Texas Football for this week's edition of Texas versus the SEC. This week's edition obviously brought to you by MyBookie. Make sure you're in the game with MyBookie. I'm CJ Vogel, joined as always by Gerry Hamilton. And Gerry, a lot to go about in the SEC this week. Of course, Texas is idle, but that doesn't mean that the playoffs hunt stops. It doesn't mean that the hunt to Atlanta stops. It means that everything continues going. Texas just gets to sit back, rest, recover, kick its feet up, and watch from the outside this week. Before we dive into it, because we got a lot, we talked about the playoff, we talked about the SEC standings, but even beyond that, Florida plays a big game against Georgia. They're a little nicked up, and obviously Arkansas as well gets a taste of what a big-time home game looks like at 11 a.m., which is going to be key for the Longhorns as well in a few weeks. But before we get into all of that, a quick word about MyBookie, our sponsor for this week's edition of Texas versus the SEC.
Yeah, Texas versus the SEC is brought to you by MyBookie. Make sure you're in the game with MyBookie. Play any matchup, hundreds of college player props, and more. With all the excitement of the season, make sure you're in the game, once again, with MyBookie. Bet any matchup, hundreds of college player props, and take advantage of those weekly risk-free bets. The best part is you can do it all anytime, anywhere, and straight from your phone. Visit mybookie.ag and use promo code ONTEXAS to get started. It's MyBookie's 10th year anniversary, and they're rolling out the red carpet for bettors. Bet big, bet confident with risk-free Thursdays. If your boosted bet doesn't hit, you'll get your money back. Weekly no sweat, win-win bets all season long. Sign up now using my ONTexas, all caps, to cash in on double deposit bonuses. It's a no-brainer. Double the cash in your account before you ever place your first bet. But do not wait. It's only a limited time availability. For those of you who've been playing with MyBookie for a while, they've got something for you too, a brand new loyalty rewards program in MyBookie Plus. It's simple. The more you play, the more you earn. And as you progress through the tiers, you unlock exclusive promotions, epic giveaways, and cash back in your account. Again, that's mybookie.ag.
Perfect. Thank you, Gerry. And thank you, MyBookie, for sponsoring Texas versus the SEC this weekend. Of course, for folks at home, you're probably gripping those to make the playoff tickets a little tighter as we enter week 10 this week. Of course, Texas is still idle, but plenty of games, plenty of teams, plenty of aspirations still alive across the SEC. By my count, 8 teams mathematically still alive, right? We came into the year thinking 2 losses was probably enough, or probably the buffer to get you into the playoff out of the SEC. Right now, 8 teams in the conference have 2 losses or less. Missouri kind of being one of those teams that maybe could be the next to lose. But right now, Gerry, let me get your big picture. Is this the competitive SEC that we anticipated? Is it maybe a little bit more, or is it a little bit maybe less?
I think it's exactly what we expected. I mean, when you see maybe more, actually. So let's think about this. Going into the season, you had Georgia, you had Texas, you're thinking Alabama, maybe LSU. Tennessee was getting a lot of run in Ole Miss. Well, now you've added A&M. And Missouri was getting some run too. So maybe you've taken out Missouri, although they're technically still in it, but they're not going to get there. And you've added A&M. And so you've added more of a power, one of the power teams, A&M versus Missouri, into that mix. So I think it's actually a little bit more, which is crazy to think about because there was so much hype going into the season for the SEC and the college football playoff. With the addition of A&M in the hunt now, I mean, you have your top 2 teams in Texas and Texas A&M, and these games suddenly have a ton of meaning the last 4 weeks of the year. I mean, Texas goes to Texas A&M November 30th. Tennessee's at Georgia coming up. Georgia's at Ole Miss in 2 weeks. I mean, Alabama is at LSU in 2 weeks. There are some big games, and what's it's creating is what we're going to love about the college football playoff. They're knockout games. They're elimination games coming up.
In a way, the playoff expands before the playoff starts, right? All of these games mean much more, no pun intended, to the SEC, but it's exciting. It's what we had hoped whenever all of this expansion talk was created. I got 2 questions for you in regards to the college football playoff. We'll start with this. 11 teams make it, right, from the Power 4, and then you have your group of 5. So 11-4, one of them is obviously going to win the conference. But from the SEC and the way that we've kind of seen the rest of college football take place, Indiana's a team that's looking pretty good. You might get 2 teams from the ACC, 2 teams from the Big 12. How many spots are available for SEC contenders at this moment?
That's a great question. And I really think it comes down to do 2 Big 12 teams get in. If 2 Big 12 teams get in, like, can you imagine 11-1, either Iowa State or Kansas State in the Big 12 championship against undefeated BYU, and that 11-1 team wins that game? So is BYU going to get left out at 12-1?
It's tough. How do you justify it?
Not. Probably not. I mean, maybe, but probably not, right? If 2 Big 12 teams get in. If you just say 2 ACC teams are going to get in, okay, and then you have Notre Dame on top of that. That's 3 spots. You have your G5. That's 4 spots, right? And so you're looking at it, if 2 Big 12s get in, that means either the Big 10 or SEC is going to end up losing a spot to me. That's the way the math's going to end up working. And what could hurt the SEC in this scenario this year is the Big 10 seems to have more paths to 11-1, 12-1 teams. That's going to be the issue for the SEC is how does this committee look at a 12-1 BYU in a scenario like that? Or what if Iowa State and BYU are both undefeated? So one's 12-0, one's 13-0, one's 12-1. Are you really leaving out Iowa State in that scenario? And if the Big 10 has more paths to 11-1 or 12-1 on their resumes, then the SEC could have a 10-2 team left out that we thought would make it before the season. I don't know. Where do you come out on that, CJ? Because it's going to get interesting.
Yeah, it's much hairier than anticipated. I mean, coming in, I thought 4 would be kind of the baseline, right? It is the superior conference. There is so much talent across the board, and you're expecting that, one, the quarterbacks and kind of the head coaches in this conference would get the nod over other conferences because of the talent they're surrounded with, right? It's the FSU argument from a year ago. But now you start looking across other conferences, and yeah, Indiana could be 11-1 when it's all said and done. There's so many different paths, like you were saying, that muddies the water. So I thought 5 could have been a possibility from the SEC earlier in the year. 3 is looking likely right now with just how muddy it is.
I mean, CJ, think about this. Look at Tennessee right now. They have Kentucky, Mississippi State at home. Should be wins. They go to Georgia. Say they drop that game, but it's a good game. Then they have North Texas, UTEP win. Then what if they go win at Vanderbilt to end the season and they're 10-2? They're going to get left out? I mean, that's the crazy thing. LSU's end of the schedule is really pretty tough. You have Bama. You have off this weekend, Bama at Florida, Vandy, OU. But they're 3 home games. I mean, if they end up as a 10-2 team and they win out, are they going to get left out of the college football playoff? What if Texas drops? What if Texas is 10-1 and loses at A&M? Are they going to get left out at 10-2 if A&M's the one that's in the SEC championship game? That's where it gets interesting if the Big 12 gets in 2 teams, because I see the SEC having a 10-2 team left at home that they didn't think they were going to be looking at the season before it began. And
that brings me to my next question. How much does style points matter, right? If Texas were to lose to Texas A&M at the end of the year, strength of schedule becomes a big topic. If Texas continues to kind of squeak by like they did against Vanderbilt, 27-24, how much will that come into play if they barely beat Arkansas, if they have a tough, close game against Kentucky? Do you need to almost go back to a BCS level scoring output where it's just blow everybody out and let the computers and the algorithms favor you in these kind of close situations?
Yeah, what's going to be interesting in regards to Texas is, okay, so Texas is 6 in the polls right now. They're going to move up a spot to 5 next week because Penn State and Ohio State play, and somebody's going to lose that game. So Texas is going to be 5 against when Florida comes to town. What Texas has going for them is it's going to be hard if they keep winning to get jumped in the polls, right? So let's say Texas is 10-1 and loses at A&M at the end of the year and falls to 10-2. Texas is probably still going to be ranked in the top 10 in the country at that point because other teams are going to lose. So would a Texas ranked, 8 in the final poll at 10-2 be left out of the playoff?
It's tough to envision.
I mean, that's the crazy thing when you look at it. So I've always said 10-2 Texas gets in. Now, the flip side of that is Tennessee, because Tennessee's one spot behind Texas in the polls. Well, what if they finish 10-2, they lose to Georgia, and Texas is 8 in the poll at 10-2, and Tennessee's 10? I mean, so either team ranked 8 or 10 is probably getting left out in that scenario, because you would have Georgia and A&M in that scenario. So
right,
it's going to get very interesting. I think for the SEC, here's who you need to be rooting against: Notre Dame. You need Notre Dame to lose at USC, because 10-2 Notre Dame does not get in because they lost to Northern Illinois.
That's a good point.
Notre Dame, if you're an SEC fan, you need to be cheering, and you already do anyways. You need to be cheering for Notre Dame loss.
I'm with you 100% on that. You call them bracket busters or spot takers in basketball. There's very much a case for that to be very similar to what we see in football at the moment. Of course, that's big picture wise. That's the playoff, and you're still talking about, and we're still talking about the SEC. So let's dwindle it down to 5, because 5 teams right now are either undefeated or have one loss in the conference. That's LSU, Tennessee, Texas, Georgia, and Texas A&M, who sits atop the standings at the moment. A lot still to happen, and we could talk about tie breaks. We could talk about the paths. But right now, these 5 remain the focal point, Jerry. And Georgia, Tennessee play each other coming up. Obviously, Texas A&M holds the tiebreaker over LSU. But Texas, again, will have a chance to win out and face Texas A&M for maybe a spot in Atlanta. Winner goes to Atlanta. Winner finds a spot in the college football playoff. What's the rest of this race looking like? Is it just down to this final group?
It sure seems like it is. Look, and you have Georgia. Obviously, they may even be the favorite in a weird way, even though A&M is undefeated. Obviously, A&M's the favorite until they lose. But Georgia, because of who's left on their schedule, they have Florida at Ole Miss and Tennessee's at home, right? They're going to beat up on Florida and Jacksonville this week. Florida's an injured football team. Then they go to Ole Miss. Then they have Tennessee. But why Georgia's in such a good spot? Then they're done. Then they have UMass and Georgia Tech. They're done with conference, and they can sit back and watch everybody else keep playing, because they end their regular season with non-conference UMass and non-conference rivalry game Georgia Tech. So that is a good place to be if you're Georgia, as long as you win out.
Yeah.
Because either A&M's going to lose, Texas is going to lose. Obviously, Georgia holds tiebreak over Texas, right? But then you have Tennessee sitting there, and they have Kentucky. They have a favorable schedule, but 2 tough road games, kind of like Texas. Kentucky, Mississippi State, 2 home games in a row. That they should win both those, get them to 5-1, right? Then they go to Georgia. Then they have UTEP. Then they have at Vandy. So they end it kind of like Texas with 2 road games of their last 3. And they're both tough road games at Georgia and at better at Vanderbilt team, who Vandy could be playing for bowl eligibility, 7th win, 8th win, who knows? But Vanderbilt's going to have something on the line in that game as well. Then you have LSU, who's off this week after the loss at A&M. They have 3 of their last 4 at home: Bama, at Florida, Vanderbilt, and Oklahoma. Very favorable schedule for those guys. Then A&M at South Carolina this week, in New Mexico State, at Auburn, and then Texas. So two road games, 2 SEC road games in one of the 2 most underrated home crowds for A&M coming up. And then we don't even need to talk about Texas. We know what that is. It's off this week. You have Florida. Then you go to Arkansas, Hornets Nest. You have Kentucky at home, and double, triple Hornets Nest in College Station. So I do think it's down to those 5. I mean, Alabama is still technically in it. Ole Miss technically in it, right? Missouri technically in it. But I think the chances are we're going to see at least 2 teams with 1 loss in the SEC championship game. I don't see it getting the teams with 2 losses being a factor for the SEC championship.
I'm with you. Again, you have 5 teams right now with 1 loss or fewer. Do you see 4 of those teams losing again to get to the 2-loss teams? I personally do not, even with, Tennessee and Georgia playing one another, Texas and Texas A&M. That would lead you, obviously, with 2 teams with 1 loss, theoretically, moving forward. One final word about our sponsor, MyBookie, and then on to the Gators, Jerry.
Yeah. Visit mybookie.ag and use that promo code ONTEXAS, all caps. That's the thing to know. It's MyBookie's 10th year anniversary, and they're rolling out the red carpet for bettors. Bet big and bet confidence with risk-free Thursdays. What's today? It's Thursday. If your boosted bet doesn't hit, you'll get your money back. Weekly, no sweat, win-win bets all season long. Again, mybookie.ag on Texas, all caps. And look, for those of you who have already been playing with MyBookie, they got something for you as well. A brand new loyalty rewards program in MyBookie Plus. It's simple. The more you play, the more you earn. As you progress through the tiers, you unlock exclusive promotions, epic giveaways, and cash back in your account. MyBookie.ag on Texas, all caps.
Here we go. Florida's hurt.
Yes.
They're banged up. A lot of big-time names are sidelined, and it's one of those things where you expect maybe if they're questionable, they go in this game. But looking ahead to Texas, that feels like perhaps a more favorable opportunity to win if you're Billy Napier, who needs a staple win at some point this year. He's maybe performed a little bit better, but you got Georgia, Texas back-to-back. They're banged up already. They'll likely be even more banged up after facing Georgia. What are your thoughts on the Gators right now with Texas set to play them a week from now?
You know, Jason Marshall being announced out for the season was a big blow to Florida because he was their top corner. They'd already lost Jakeem Jackson, another talented corner, for extended period of time. So now you're going to see a Cormani McClain who had a pick six against Kentucky, more of those guys. But Jason Marshall's a big loss for them. That is a experienced corner, an NFL draft pick level corner, and a guy that they've leaned on at that position. So they're now without him. Eugene Wilson, who had the knee scope, missed some time, came back, played against Tennessee, Kentucky. He's already been ruled out for the Georgia game. So obviously we'll see where he's at for the Texas game. But look, for this week, R.J. Moten, inside linebacker, is questionable. The running back, Montrell Johnson, missed Kentucky. He's questionable. Now, Jaden Ball, their big 6'1", 230-pound freshman, is a really good player. Went for 106 against Kentucky. Damian George, one of their starting guards, or offensive linemen, I should say, is questionable for this game. It's a bad look for Florida going into Georgia, and they're going to get beat up physically. And I'll say this. What's the number? About 20, CJ? I almost like Georgia to cover here because Florida has not stopped the run all season. And that's really scary against Georgia, who while Georgia hasn't run the ball for big yardage in games this year, look, Travis Etienne's really good. Nate Frazier's really good. And if you struggle to stop the run against Georgia, they're going to get going downhill on you. Then they're going to throw the ball over the top on you with Carson Beck. And I think it's a really bad matchup for Florida. And I'll say this, the key thing for Texas fans watching Florida for me is Florida's got to keep DJ Lagway healthy. And he's a guy who's a freshman quarterback. If you take away the one AA game against Samford, which is his first start, he was 18 and 25 for like 456 and 3 touchdowns. But take away the FCS game. He's a true freshman quarterback that's had 2 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, has been sacked 5 or 6 times, and will take hits because he's a big guy outside the pocket because he's 6'3", 235 pounds. None of that sounds good against Georgia to me. So Florida's got to keep him healthy with the schedule coming up for them because it's Texas, it's LSU, it's Ole Miss, it's Florida State. Florida State's made it look easier for them, but yeah, keep it for the Texas game in 2 weeks. Florida better keep DJ Lagway upright and healthy going into Austin because they already have a lot of injuries they're dealing with, and impactful injuries in the secondary, which helps Texas against Florida because they're not a great pass rushing team. Linebacker, if they have any issues there. And then if Eugene Wilson, if he still can't go against Texas, they're a different team because he's their best pro prospect at wideout.
Absolutely. That's a great breakdown. And, of course, not a place you want to be in if you're Billy Napier again in what is widely considered one of the toughest schedules college football has ever seen. But for folks who do have that game on their televisions this weekend, Jerry, looking ahead, maybe doing some scouting for what's to come for the Florida Gators, what is one thing that Texas fans can watch on the Florida side and say, okay, that's what Texas needs to be looking out for whenever they come to town in just about, 8 days? Yeah.
It's Jaden Ball, downhill run game. DJ Lagway making some athletic plays, even though he's a bigger guy. He's not a run. He's not a guy you're going to do a lot of design run stuff for, but he can make plays with his feet. That's what I'm kind of looking for is does Florida have any success running the football against Georgia at all? If they do, then that becomes a little different for Texas because Texas fans saw how hard it is to run the ball, difficult it is to run the ball against Georgia.
Right.
So Montrell Johnson, if he plays, Jaden Ball, Lagway, what can they do moving the football on the ground against Georgia? If they can't do anything at all, that bodes very well for Texas against Florida next week, because Florida struggles to stop the run, which we'll get into next week, CJ, but that's going to be interesting how the Sark attack Florida. That's going to be for next week to talk about. But I think for this game, if Florida can't establish any run against Georgia, I think that's a really good time for Texas.
Good deal. Of course, you'll get to watch all of that this weekend as Texas sits back, relaxes, recovers, and looks ahead to what is going to be a crazy final month in the SEC across college football. So for Gerry Hamilton, I'm CJ Vogel. This has been Texas versus the SEC. Until next weekend, when we get the Horns back in action, y'all enjoy the weekend. Hook 'em.